I never believed in superstitions, let alone stories about demons. That kind of stuff was just what you heard in mythology class, something you listened to and then forgot about. But now, sitting alone in my room, I can't ignore the nightmares anymore, or the fact that every time I wake up, there are new marks on my skin. It all started a few weeks ago. That first dream didn't seem any different from the usual ones. There was a man. He appeared in the middle of a thick fog, tall and mysterious, with a kind of charm that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I could sense his presence even before I saw him. His voice, soft as the wind, whispered my name. When I woke up that first morning, my skin tingled, leaving me with the eerie feeling that something invisible had been touching me. Back then, I didn't think much of it. It was just a dream, right? Nothing to worry about. But then the dreams came back. Night after night, the same man, getting closer every time. His hands, cold and powerful, would glide over my skin, wrapping me in a mix of desire and fear that I couldn't understand. And each time I woke up, something was different. Fine scratches, barely noticeable at first, but soon impossible to ignore. Those scratches started to really freak me out when I realized there was no logical explanation for them. I live alone, and as much as I tried to convince myself I was doing it in my sleep, it didn't make sense. Not with how precise the marks were. It was like something, or someone, was touching me while I slept. My friends, Erica and Julia, laughed when I told them. "You're probably just having some spicy dreams, Bianca," Erica teased, making everyone laugh. But I wasn't laughing. I tried, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. Something was off. That night, before going to bed, I spent a little extra time in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. Dark circles were starting to form, and my face had this strange paleness. I need better sleep, I thought. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Then came the night when everything changed. The dream was different. The fog was thicker, suffocating, and the man? He was so close I could feel his cold breath on the back of my neck. He pulled me in with this overpowering force I couldn't escape. When I woke up, my body was covered in purple bruises, like invisible fingers had dug into my skin. I screamed. For the first time in a long time, I screamed out of pure fear. Fear of something I couldn't explain. Things got worse when Erica called me the next day. She had marks too. She said she'd had a weird dream, almost identical to what I'd described. The same man, the same feeling of suffocation. Julia was still laughing it off, saying we were feeding off each other's imaginations, but even she seemed uncomfortable. Every night the man came back, always more seductive, always more real. I started looking for answers, desperate for an explanation. That's when I found a word that sent a chill down my spine. Incubus. A demon that feeds off its victim's life energy, especially during sleep. An invisible parasite that uses the human body as its source of sustenance. But what really terrified me was reading that it could kill. Slowly, draining every last drop of life until there's nothing left but an empty shell. I was already weak. Every day, I felt more drained, completely out of energy. The marks on my skin were getting deeper, almost like open wounds. When I told Julia what I had found out, she went pale, and Erica, who was already on the verge of a breakdown, suggested we seek spiritual help. That's how we met Marta, a local psychic. She welcomed us into her small house filled with candles and incense, and the second we crossed the door, a chill ran down my spine. "You're marked," was the first thing she said. Her gaze was intense, almost piercing, like she could see right through us. Marta revealed that the incubus didn't show up by chance. He had been summoned. Someone close to me wanted me to suffer, to die slowly. The shock was immediate. But who would do something like that? The ritual she told us to do seemed simple, but full of risks. It required courage, and I was already desperate. I couldn't keep losing sleep, my nights, my sanity. That night, my friends and I gathered in my room, surrounded by candles, salt, and symbols Marta had given us. The air felt heavy, each second filled with this invisible tension. Then he showed up. Not in my dreams, but in real life. He materialized right in front of us, his eyes deep and dark, a cruel smile on his lips. The ritual failed. The incubus got violent, his invisible claws dragging Julia to the floor. I screamed, but it was useless. One by one, he killed them, and I watched helplessly as my friends' lives were drained away until there was nothing left. Now, I'm alone. Too weak to fight. He's watching me from the corner of the room, smiling. The air feels thick with silence, and I know there's no escape. But just before I lose the last bit of my consciousness, something happens. For the first time, I see his face clearly, without the fog that had always covered it in my dreams. My heart stops. It's Gabriel. Gabriel, my ex-boyfriend. The shock is just as devastating as the truth. He betrayed me. He, the one who once promised to love me, is now condemning me. He's the one who summoned the Incubus. He couldn't handle the breakup. He wants to destroy me in the slowest and most painful way possible. The moment I finally understand, my vision starts to fade. The Incubus, or Gabriel, smiles again, like he knows he's won. And as the world around me disappears, a single tear rolls down my cheek. In the end, the betrayal hurts more than death. I was exhausted when I finally made it to that remote inn. It was this place lost in the mountains, far from everything and everyone. The forest around was thick, and the wind made the trees bend, letting out low, almost mournful howls. When I saw the old, worn-out wooden sign hanging at the entrance, I felt a brief sense of relief. The sign simply said, Mountain Inn. That's it. No details, no flashy signs, but it seemed like the perfect spot to crash for the night before continuing my journey the next day. I had been walking for hours. My feet were killing me, my back throbbed under the weight of my backpack, and I was so tired I could barely see straight. When I opened the inn's door, a frail bell jingled, and the scent of old wood and a crackling fireplace wrapped around me. There was this strange quietness in the air, like the outside world couldn't touch this place. The reception was empty, except for a small golden bell sitting on a cracked wooden counter. I rang it, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. Seconds later, an old woman, thin as if time itself had eaten her away, stepped out from behind a heavy curtain. Her eyes, sunken and dark, studied me with a mix of curiosity and weariness. Her smile was slow, almost suspicious. "Just one night, right?" she asked, her voice too soft for the oppressive silence around us. I nodded, not thinking much about it. The last thing I wanted was to spend more than one night there. She handed me a key, and as I walked down the dimly lit hallway toward my room, something felt off. Maybe it was the old-fashioned decor, the long, narrow corridors that seemed to stretch further than expected. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite the worn-out sign outside, I hadn't seen a single other guest. Still, my exhaustion outweighed my caution. My room was simple, a solid wood bed, sheets that looked like they'd been washed so many times they'd lost their color, and a window that opened to the pitch-black forest outside. I barely had time to unpack before sleep hit me like a tidal wave. I crashed onto the bed ready to disconnect from the world. But that night, something kept me on the edge of sleep, like an invisible hand pulling me toward a place I didn't want to be. The dream started gently, almost like a blurred memory. I was standing in an open field, the moon lighting up the trees around me. In the middle of the field, a woman with long dark hair watched me, her face hidden in shadows. Something about her drew me in this primal, irrational way. When I took a step toward her, a chill ran down my spine. Her silhouette started to distort, slowly transforming into something darker, more masculine. What had seemed graceful and alluring was now menacing. He moved toward me, and I couldn't move. I jolted awake, my body drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, but something was different. As I looked around, I realized the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. I went to the window, and through the darkness, I saw vague figures outside. They didn't walk, they glided through the tall grass, like ownerless shadows. Sleepwalkers, I thought immediately. Maybe they were the other guests. But something was wrong with the way they moved. It was disjointed, lifeless, like they were being controlled by something that wasn't their own. The next morning, I headed down to the dining room for breakfast. There were other guests now, sitting at different tables, all in silence. Their eyes were distant, their skin pale, with deep shadows under their eyes. I tried making conversation with the woman next to me, but she just gave me a blank stare, like I was a ghost. No one seemed to really be there. It didn't take long for me to notice they all had something in common, the same empty gaze, the same exhaustion, like their souls were being slowly drained. And as the sun began to set that evening, a wave of dread started creeping in. Something was seriously wrong with this place. That night, the dreams came back. But this time, it wasn't just a dream. I felt the weight of something next to me in bed, like someone had laid down beside me. A metallic smell invaded my nostrils, strong and overpowering. Blood. I couldn't move. I was pinned to the bed. And in the corner of the room, the male figure watched me, his eyes glowing with insane malice. When I finally managed to move, I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by fear. In the days that followed, I started digging into the inn's history. I asked the woman at the front desk, but she just smiled, her gaze always watchful, like she knew more than she was letting on. I searched for clues around the area and in the nearby village, and finally, I uncovered the horrifying truth. The inn had a history of mysterious disappearances. People who stayed more than one night were never seen again. That's when it clicked. The Incubus, an ancient demon that fed on life and souls, lived in that place. It kept people trapped, stealing their dreams and eventually their lives. Those other guests, they were already dead. I was living among walking corpses, dead in their beds, their faces frozen in pure terror. Desperate, I tried to escape. That night, I ran through the inn's hallways, feeling the incubus's presence closing in behind me. The air was thick and heavy, and the floor seemed to stretch endlessly under my feet. When I finally reached the exit, something cold grabbed my ankle. I fell, hitting my head on the ground, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the inn's bed. The silence was absolute, crushing. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The weight of the incubus pressed down on me, pinning me in place. Its face now fully revealed, skin deathly white, eyes as black as an endless abyss. That's when I realized I was never getting out of there. I never should have gone to that party. It was one of those weird nights, you know? The kind where everything feels just a little off. The breeze was thick, almost sticky, carrying a chill that didn't match the season. Even the stars seemed dimmed, hidden by a thin mist curling through the sky. Still, the invite was tempting. A group of acquaintances from art school, people I didn't know well but who were always the cool crowd, mentioned there was going to be a party at a mansion out of town. At first, I hesitated. I didn't really know who was hosting. It was someone I'd seen a few times in the university halls, a guy who seemed to show up at every party but always kept to the sidelines, just watching. But the idea of a party at a mansion, the mystery, the adventure, it drew me in. Everyone else was going, so why not? Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. The mansion was huge, but in that way that makes you feel small, insignificant. Its stone walls rose high, covered in moss, like time and neglect had claimed it. Yet it still held this eerie kind of elegance. The path leading up to the front door was lined with twisted trees, their long shadows stretching across the ground like claws trying to grab us. When I finally stepped through the double doors, it was like walking into another world. The hall was packed with beautiful, well-dressed people. Their laughter and voices filled the air, but I couldn't quite make out what anyone was saying. There was something about their faces, something in their eyes that made me uncomfortable. They were too attractive, almost unnaturally so. I felt out of place with my simple outfit and messy hair. But there was more. The atmosphere was heavy, thick. I couldn't explain it. There was this unsettling feeling that I was being watched, that this wasn't just a party. It was like the mansion itself was alive, with walls that breathed and shadows that shifted ever so slightly. My instincts were screaming for me to leave, but something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because, all of a sudden, I felt inexplicably drawn to the place. Hours blurred by, and I lost track of time. I couldn't remember when the party had really started, who had invited me, or even how I'd gotten there. The wine tasted metallic and heavy, and after a few sips, I started seeing things. Indistinct figures, shapes moving in the shadows, distorted faces among the crowd. Yet no one else seemed to notice. They laughed, danced, their expressions distant, almost empty, like they were all in some kind of trance. And then I saw it. A creature. At first glance, it was just a shadow, darker than the rest, lingering on the edge of the party, between the flickering candles and the slow-swaying old curtains. But there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. I felt its attention on me, like a weight on my chest, a chill running from the back of my neck down to my feet. Every time I turned my head, that shadow seemed to be closer. That night, the faces around me started to change. The gleam in people's eyes grew brighter, but in a way that wasn't human. Their smiles turned sharp, almost predatory. Something was eating away at them from the inside, consuming them, and suddenly it hit me. They weren't here for fun. They were prey, and I was too. I started hearing whispers. At first, they were soft, mixed in with the music and laughter. But as the night went on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just the tiredness and the drinks. But the voice, that voice, it came from the shadows, and it was calling me. The Incubus. I didn't know what it was until I heard others mention it, in the whispers, among the shadows. That creature was using the party as bait, drawing people in to feed off their souls. Every guest was under its spell, trapped, slowly being drained by that demon. It left them intoxicated, lost in pleasure and despair, until there was nothing left, and I was next in line. When I finally decided to leave, the mansion turned into an endless maze. The hallway I could have sworn I just walked through stretched out forever in front of me. Every door I opened led back to the same party hall, back to the start, where the guests now looked dead, with glazed-over eyes and empty smiles. And the shadow, it was there, getting closer, more real by the second. I was cornered. The bodies of those who tried to escape before me were scattered everywhere, thrown aside like broken dolls, each with the same frozen look of sheer terror, their faces twisted into masks of pain. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but the Incubus was on me, its form fully revealed. A man, almost impossibly perfect, with eyes glowing an evil red and teeth gleaming menacingly in the flickering candlelight. Then I remembered the legend, a story I'd overheard somewhere from an old book, a mirror, the one thing that could trap demons. I ran frantically through the halls until I found an old, dusty mirror at the end of one of the many empty rooms. I didn't know if the story was real or just some silly myth, but at that moment, I had nothing to lose. The Incubus lunged. Its presence was suffocating, pulling the air out of the room as I gripped the mirror. When it leapt at me, I shoved the mirror between us, and I saw its reflection in the glass. Its face twisted in rage and pain, and suddenly the mirror's surface rippled like water. It was sucked inside, its scream muffled as its form disappeared, leaving the room in a deadly silence. I got out. But the mansion? It never let me go. The feeling of being watched still haunts me. I know somewhere behind the glass of that mirror, it's still there, waiting. I've seen some weird things during my time on the force. Stuff that would keep a normal person up at night, mess with their head. You try to get used to it, or at least pretend to. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what I saw on that case. The first time I walked into that crime scene, I froze. It wasn't just the usual horror of finding a body, the violence I'd grown almost numb to. It was different. It stuck to your skin and made you break out in a cold sweat. The bodies, they were marked in ways I'd never seen before, hurt in a way that felt cruelly deliberate, calculated, like something, not just someone, had done it while the victims were still breathing. The victims were all women, young, their lives cut short, but it wasn't the blood or the mutilations that got to me. It was their faces. God, the look on their faces. A twisted, forced smile, frozen in a mix of what I can only call ecstasy and pain. The contrast between the suffering of their bodies and that sick, perverse satisfaction on their faces took my breath away in a way nothing ever had before. Like they'd been forced to feel pleasure in death against their will. The first clues pointed to some kind of cult, a messed up torture ritual. But things started to get even weirder. Yeah, weirder. When some witnesses mentioned a man showing up in the victim's dreams. It sounded ridiculous, like some urban legend, but all the women had said something similar in the days before they died. A handsome, charming man who appeared in their dreams. He seduced them, invaded their minds in such a real way that when they woke up, they could still feel his touch, smell him, feel the warmth of his presence. They couldn't explain the growing fear they felt, a fear that built up until the day their lives were taken. Over time, the case began to consume me. I read and reread every report like I might find something hidden in the cold words. Every night I'd come home, and before I fell asleep, that uneasiness would settle in, the weight of the unknown. But it wasn't until the dreams started that I understood real fear. It started off small. At first, I'd see him at a distance, a blurry figure blending into the dreamscape, like he was part of the dream itself. But each night, he got closer, clearer. A man, disturbingly perfect, with dark eyes that seemed to look right through you, strip you bare. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic. He'd smile at me in a way that twisted my stomach with pure dread. But there was something about him that kept me stuck. An irresistible pull that made me question my own sanity. The dreams kept coming, more intense each time, and then I started noticing marks on my body when I woke up. At first, just small scratches, easy to ignore. But soon enough, they became real wounds, deep carved into my skin like scars from something ancient and evil. It was like he was toying with me, marking me little by little, like a hunter savoring the slow destruction of his prey before the final strike. I knew I had to do something, so I started looking for answers in places where logic didn't really apply anymore. I went to an occultist, someone most people would call a fraud, but I was out of options. When he looked at me, his eyes flickered with surprise, like he already knew. What he told me made me question everything. That thing you see in your dreams isn't a man, it's an incubus, he said with this unnervingly calm voice. It feeds on fear, on desire, not just your life energy, but the mental torment of its victims. It's preparing you, Felix. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets. The more you fight, the more it feeds. I tried to resist, avoid sleep. I spent entire nights pacing back and forth in my apartment, fighting off heavy eyelids, my body begging for rest. But the exhaustion slowly broke me down. By the fifth night without sleep, I was on the edge of collapse. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold my gun. The hallucinations started, blurring the line between what was real and what was a nightmare. I could feel his presence all the time, even when I was awake. Watching over my shoulder, lurking in the corners of my vision. He was pulling me in, draining every bit of sanity I had left until I couldn't take it anymore. One of those nights, I finally gave in. Exhaustion won, and then there he was, sitting beside my bed, smiling in a way that could only be described as victorious. He didn't say a word, but I knew what was coming. I felt the air get heavier, my body growing more paralyzed with every second. The fear hit me, and for a moment I wanted to fight, wanted to scream. But the terror, it was suffocating. There was no escape. The last thing I remember was his touch. Cold, lethal, draining every inch of life as the world around me collapsed. My body froze, unable to move, while I was still fully aware, trapped inside myself. When they found me the next day, it was too late. That twisted, smiling face, frozen in a sick mix of pleasure and pain, the marks carved into my skin, everything pointed to the incubus, but no one would believe it. No one would even understand the horror of what really went down. And so the mystery remained unsolved. The incubus, satisfied, moved on to its next victim, and me. I became just another corpse, just another footnote in an unsolved case. I was the cop hunting monsters. Now I'm just another one of their victims. The casino lights flashed in colorful bursts all around me, but it was all just a blur. My hands gripped the cards tightly, fingertips slightly damp with sweat. Every breath I took, I could feel the weight of the chips, smell the unmistakable mix of cigarette smoke and booze, mixed with the electricity hanging in the air. The table was full, but the world felt small, like it was just me and the cards in front of me. I was on top of my game. Nothing could stop me, or at least that's what I thought. It was a night like any other, or it should have been. I was winning. I could read every move the other players made, like I could predict their thoughts before they even knew what to do next. I had this almost supernatural confidence, and it was right at that peak when everything started to shift. That same night, I had the first dream. At first, it seemed harmless, almost normal. A woman appeared, one of those flawless types you only see in movies, too perfect to be real. The kind of beauty that pulls you in but hides something unsettling underneath. She was there, smiling at me in a way that was supposed to be inviting, but there was something in her eyes, something that made my spine tingle. In the dreams, she'd always approach slowly, her cold, slender fingers touching my face, my arms. At first, I was mesmerized. Who wouldn't be? But each time I saw her, something changed, something small, almost too subtle to notice. What was once a perfect figure started to warp, turning into something darker, heavier. Her hair, once long and soft, now moved like it was alive, slithering in the shadows around her. And then she became him. A man, or at least something that looked like a man, but wasn't human. His presence was suffocating, like the air itself was being pressed down. His smile wasn't a smile, it was a threat wrapped in a grin. The dreams came every night, and I'd wake up with marks. At first, I chalked it up to stress. The poker world isn't for the weak. Every day, going up against people who are out to beat you, who lie with their eyes and their hands. But soon I realized the marks were something else. Thin scars, like razor cuts, appeared in places I couldn't explain. On my neck, on my arms, on my chest. Dark patches like bruises, but I had no memory of how I got them. That's when the other players started dying. They weren't natural deaths, not accidents either. One by one, they were found in hotel rooms, their faces frozen in pure terror, bodies twisted and disfigured. Each of these players, once champions at their own tables, were now lying like broken dolls. And they all had one thing in common. They'd all mentioned strange dreams before they died. I started to feel trapped. The fear slowly replaced the confidence I always had. What was this? Who was that man? Or whatever the hell he was. Nights became torture, a mix of insomnia and nightmares. Sleepless nights at the casino, followed by early mornings where I'd stare at myself in the mirror, watching the marks multiply, the exhaustion and desperation taking over. That's when I went to Luca, an old friend who always seemed to have the answers to everything. When I told him what was going on, he just stayed quiet for a long time, which was rare for him. "You're dealing with an incubus, Carl," he said, his voice heavy in a way I'd never heard before. "It's not just some regular demon. He feeds off your energy, your desires, your fears. And the worst part, he won't stop until he drains you completely." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. All the signs were there, and I was being pulled into the same fate as the others. In the days that followed, my luck at the tables started to dry up. Every hand, every new round, I could feel the weight of the incubus growing. It was like he was sitting there, right next to me, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to knock me down. The games got longer, the bets got higher, but I knew I wasn't just playing against the other players anymore. I was gambling with my own life. It was on the last night when I was on the verge of breaking that he appeared to me outside of the dreams. In the casino, between the clinking of chips and the murmur of players, there he was, at the far end of the table, smiling at me with that same sickening, familiar grin. His look was the kind you give when you've already won. I felt a chill run down my spine, like I'd been touched by a cold wind that no one else could feel. "One last bet, Carl," he whispered, his voice like sweet poison. "Your life for one chance. Bet it all, or walk away now." I knew there was no escape. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about the game. It was about me. My soul was on the line, and I had only one choice: play or lose everything. With shaky hands, I agreed. I knew it was my only shot. My cards were awful, a complete disaster. But somehow, a tiny spark of hope flickered inside me. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was pure madness, but I made the riskiest play of my life. I looked at him at the incubus, and I went all in. And then, he laughed. It was a cold, empty laugh that echoed in my mind. But as he leaned forward, sure of his victory, the game flipped. My cards, they were better than they seemed. I don't know how, but I won. He vanished, his form dissolving into the casino smoke like he'd never been there at all. But what stayed with me was an empty feeling, like something wasn't finished. Even though I won, I knew he was still out there, waiting, watching. I quit poker that night, walked away from everything, the glamour, the money, the lights. But I could never shake the feeling of being followed. I won the game, sure, but I paid a price. Because somewhere in the shadows, the incubus is still watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. And deep down, I know he always does.